Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Dr. Ann. Welcome to Food is Medicine. As you can see, this is typically a little bit of a smaller group, and so it's a pretty informal class, even though I have to be up at the podium today because we're recording this. Usually I like to be down because I don't like standing up here. I move around a lot. But this is pretty informal. So if you guys have any questions as we kind of go through all this, stop me, raise your hand. Definitely get your questions answered because we'll probably go off on different tangents, but I want this class to be what you guys want to know. So, but as you'll see, we've got a lot of content to get through, and so I talk fast, and I tend to go through things pretty quickly. So again, if you need me to stop, raise your hand. If you need the restrooms, they're just down the hall, and so feel free to get up and move around because I'll try and keep rolling just so we can get through as much of this as possible. So just out of curiosity, is anybody new to the clinic? Okay, so we have a few new people. Okay, great. So what this class is I like this class to be kind of a foundational class. We have a lot of our co-learners take this class, a lot of our patients take this class, because as you'll see, as we start going through all of this, there's a lot you can do for your health, but if your diet is lacking and if you're missing kind of some key foundational things, then you're just not going to feel as well as you probably could. And the analogy I use to describe this is if you're in a canoe, and there's a hole in your canoe and water's coming in, taking supplements or taking even prescription drugs is like handing you a bucket, and you can work really hard to flush all that water out and you can probably stay afloat. But if you just plug that hole, then you're not going to have to work so hard, not have to spend so much money on everything, and everything will just flow a lot easier. So I like to start with this quote because I think this illustrates that concept well, that the food you eat can either be the safest and most powerful medicine, or it can be the slowest form of poison. And that's true, that especially in our world today, we don't always tend to connect some of our symptoms with what we're eating, but very, very often how you feel is a direct correlation with what you're eating. And, I think a lot of us, we feel, feeling tired, feeling less energy, not sleeping well, feeling achy, having headaches, all of those just kind of become normal things that we kind of forget what it feels like to feel well. And so, really cleaning up your diet can help you really, understand what it feels like to feel well. So kind of where we're going to be going with this class is, we're going to spend the first probably 3/4 of the class on this first section. We're going to talk a lot about a concept called inflammation. We're going to talk about how inflammation connects with your diet, and then also how inflammation connects with a lot of the chronic diseases that we're seeing today, and why it seems, I don't know if anybody feels this way, but it feels like everybody's sick these days. Everybody's on prescription meds. Everybody's, especially starting very young, babies and young kids are just on antibiotics and steroid meds and, anti-acid meds. I mean, it just seems like everybody is sick these days. And a lot of that stems from we're just inflamed. And so how does inflammation connect with the diet is something we'll spend a lot of time talking about. But then we'll also talk about leaky gut. Is that a new term for anybody? Is everyone's kind of heard that? It's amazing. Over about the 3 years we've been doing this class, when I first started, leaky gut was new to most people in the class. And now I think most people have at least heard that term before. So that's good. It's getting more kind of widespread awareness, but we'll talk about what exactly that is, what it means to have leaky gut, mechanically what that looks like, and then how that feels as well. And then we'll talk about at the very end, with what time we have left, how you heal the gut, and, a lot of that section overlaps with the first section, but we'll talk about a few more specific things as far as supplements and whatnot. So before we dive into all of this, I like to do a little bit of a review of the digestive system, because if you haven't had anatomy before, or if it's been, 10 or 15 years since you had your, anatomy in high school or college, for most people, digestion is kind of this black box. You take something very appetizing and it goes into your body, and then it comes out something very unappetizing. So what's happening kind of in that space between, and understanding this will help with some of the understanding of what we talk about down the road. But does anybody know, where does digestion actually start? What's the first step in the digestive process? Any ideas? No brave souls. A lot of times, what we think of the first step is in the mouth. When you start chewing food, when your saliva actually has a lot of digestive enzymes in it that help break down carbohydrates. That's why you can't put, more than a few saltine crackers in your mouth at a time without, coughing and spitting it out, because you need those digestive enzymes in your saliva to break down those carbohydrates so that your body, you can swallow that, and it can make it down your esophagus. And so, but I always make the argument that there's one step in the digestive process that's extremely important, that is even before we put food in our mouth. And that's our sensory system. So when you smell a food, if you've ever walked in, and you're not hungry, but you smell cookies baking and all of a sudden your stomach starts rumbling or you start salivating, that's your body preparing for digestion because it's smelling something that smells really good. And then visually, color is a huge clue for us about what is nutritionally good for us. If you've ever wondered why, foods that are colorful are more visually appealing, that's because in nature, the more color a food has, the more nutritional value, the more antioxidants, the more phytonutrients it has. And we'll talk about this more as we go, but, food companies like to manipulate, some of those mechanisms that we have. And so, that's why Skittles and M&Ms are colorful, is because they know that we're attracted to that color. And so, that candy is going to be more appetizing to us just based on the color. So, so some of those visual sensory cues play a big role in what we actually decide that we're going to put in our mouth. So, but after you put food in the mouth and you chew it and, the saliva, the enzymes in your saliva start digesting it, then that food goes down your esophagus into the stomach. The stomach is right here. And the stomach, I'm kind of on a campaign to bring back the stomach, because I feel like the stomach is one of the most underappreciated steps in the digestive process, because most of the time, what do we associate with the stomach? Stomach acid. We associate reflux. I think I read that 1 in 10 people in the United States is on some sort of acid blocking med. So that's a 10% of our population is having the symptom of reflux. And so, is it we just have this, epidemic of too much stomach acid in our world? No, the real answer is the acid in the stomach plays a vitally important role in the digestive process, because that's what breaks down our proteins. So, when you eat a piece of chicken, you have to break that chicken down into something called amino acids. And I think of amino acids kind of like Legos. They're different shapes, different colors, different sizes. But when you break down these proteins into amino acids, your body can then use the amino acids to rebuild all the different structures in the body, after those amino acids get absorbed. But if you're not breaking down those proteins and those amino acids aren't available, then you're not going to be able to absorb them. And then second of all, if you don't fully break down those proteins and you get further along, you've got leaky gut, now all of a sudden those larger proteins are going to be triggering food allergies and food sensitivities. And so breaking down, the food in the stomach is a really crucial role in the digestive process. Now, the other thing that acid does is it also kills bacteria, parasites, fungi. So all the stuff that's on our food, that even though our food is much cleaner than it's ever been, in human history, we still get a lot of bacteria on the food that we eat. And so if that stomach acid is too low, you're not going to kill those pathogens, and those are going to populate further along in the digestive tract. Now, why is it then that, so many people are on acid blocking meds? Why is it that so many people have reflux? And ironically, the biggest reason we found that people have the symptom of reflux is not because it's too much acid, but actually because they have too little stomach acid. So what happens when, that food goes down your esophagus and that your stomach starts to stretch? What the brain senses is it senses that stretch, and it also senses the body releasing the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So that sends a signal to the brain that the brain then comes down and it closes right here, what's called your lower esophageal sphincter. So that sphincter is what kind of closes that spot up so that all the contents of the stomach stay in the stomach while it's churning, because it's a big muscle. And so if that sphincter doesn't close and it stays open, as soon as the stomach starts churning, you're going to get that symptom of reflux. You're going to actually get the contents that reflux up into the esophagus, and you'll get burning. So, so really for most people, it's actually too little acid in the stomach that, that creates that issue. And how you can tell if it's too little acid is, when you have too little acid, that's typically accompanied by bloating with meals, or if you eat, a normal sized meal, but you feel really, really full, like, stuffed after you eat, very often that's too little stomach acid. If you've got undigested food material in your stools, if something you can visibly see the spinach that you ate, in your stools, that very often is, too little stomach acid. And so, there's ways you can supplementally boost stomach acid, but what that very often does for people is you boost that stomach acid enough, and then that triggers the closure of that sphincter, and then that symptom goes away. Now, the other big reason that I see people have the symptom of reflux is due to inflammation, because of food sensitivities. So there are a few big foods that can create a lot of inflammation in the stomach, which can also create, that symptom of reflux. So, but after the food gets churned in the stomach, after the acid starts breaking down all those proteins, the food leaves the stomach and it goes into this first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. And you can't really see it, but back behind the stomach there is the pancreas. And so this spot right here is where the pancreas dumps digestive enzymes, which I don't know if anybody's ever taken digestive enzymes as a supplement, or if you've heard about digestive enzymes, but digestive enzymes are specific molecules that help break down specific types of foods. So probably the best known digestive enzyme is lactase. If you've ever known somebody who's lactose intolerant, they don't make enough of that lactase enzyme. And so without that lactase enzyme getting dumped right here, as that dairy, those dairy proteins move through the stomach, that creates a lot of gastrointestinal issues. So, but we have a lot of other enzymes. So not just lactase, but we have stuff to break down fats like lipases. We have certain ones to break down carbohydrates like amylases. So those digestive enzymes are extremely important to help continue to break down, the food after it leaves the stomach. Because by the time the food gets to the small intestine, which is right here, the small intestine's job is absorption. This is where we absorb minerals, vitamins, fats, amino acids, all of those different things that the body needs to survive get absorbed across the small intestine. So this is where, when we talk about leaky gut, this is where leaky gut happens, is in the small intestine. And so, and it's actually, it's all curled up in this picture, but I think I've heard this statistic that if you spread it all out end to end, it would cover like 4 tennis courts, So, I mean, it's a really large surface area that's all kind of contained, but it's extremely important, like I said, for absorption, to be able to get all the nutrients the body needs. So then after the food, you kind of suck out all the things that we need out of the food, and you're left with a lot of waste. Then you get to the large intestine, or the colon, and this is mostly all about waste removal. So this is where, when we talk about the microbiome and we talk about the good bacteria, most of that exists within the colon, or the large intestine. And so it's going to continue to break down that waste material. This is where the liver, through the biliary system, dumps a lot of waste from the body, gets dumped. And so that by the time you get here, it gets eliminated. And so, this, I always like to say, with the colon, if you think about this as kind of the waste removal system, people who are constipated, despite what your doctor says, it is not normal to go a whole week without having a bowel movement, and so, and you can start to picture that if you're not having a bowel movement at the very least every day, all that waste, can start to build up in this system. And then, there's still a transfer of material that can happen. And so if it doesn't get eliminated, that waste can get recirculated back into your system. And so, so if you don't get anything else from this class, make sure you're having a bowel movement every day, and you will feel like a new person. And the best way to do that is magnesium. If you struggle with constipation, magnesium is a great way to get bowels moving. So that's kind of, our digestive system. And like I said, we'll start to talk about some of the more specific components of this as we go. But as a whole, this whole system works together. And it's kind of the whole thing, each step in the digestive process prepares for the next. And so if you're missing something, if you're not chewing your food correctly, or you don't have enough stomach acid, or you don't have digestive enzymes, all the rest of the way through, your body's going to have a harder time getting the nutrients out of the food, to be able to support, what the body and what it needs. So does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay. So again, one concept, that I'm going to kind of keep going back to as we go along in this class is that the digestive system we have is not designed for the world that we live in. And when you look at our ancestors and how our ancestors ate, and some of the habits and the patterns that they had that are different from us today, you can start to see where things have gone off track for us, because, our digestive system was designed to eat a lot of plant-based material. It was not designed to process all the chemicals, that we're exposed to in foods. It was not designed to process trans fats, didn't know what trans fats were. And so, because of that, we are struggling, with a lot of digestive issues and a lot of inflammatory issues. And so that's a concept we'll explore, as we go. But there are a few other things I like to talk about, that what our ancestors did differently compared to what we're doing today, because all of these kind of set the stage for why we are so sick. And so when you look at how our ancestors ate, a few things that they did that were different compared to what we do today is, as I mentioned in the beginning, our sensory system is extremely important for determining what we're going to actually physically put in our bodies, because this whole idea of eating food has kind of been lost on us today, because we can go to the grocery store and buy food and it's going to be reasonably safe for us. It's not going to kill us immediately. But if you go back even, a couple thousand years with our ancestors, everything they took from the environment and they put in their bodies, that was a big deal. If they picked the wrong berry and it was poisonous, that could kill them. If they ate rancid meat that had, bacteria growing on it, that could kill them. So they were highly attuned to what they were putting in our bodies. And I think for us today, because we are becoming so much more separated from where our food actually comes from, food for kids today just comes from the grocery store. They don't know where a banana comes from, or, where sweet potato comes from, because we're becoming more and more separated from the source of our food. We're not as connected and we're not as aware of what we're actually putting in our bodies. And so, so one thing our ancestors did differently is they were highly reliant upon their sensory system to decipher what they were going to eat and what they were not going to eat. So this is one thing that we can do today that, if we, just start kind of looking at labels, reading labels, really looking at ingredients, researching ingredients, you'll probably be surprised at what we are actually consuming and what actually does make it into our food. So another thing that our ancestors did differently is they spent a lot of time around food, hunting food, growing food, preparing food, which, this is a huge luxury and a huge, evolutionary, move forward for us, that we don't have to spend our entire day foraging for food. But at the same time, we've kind of swung too far in the opposite direction, where we don't spend much time actually investing in preparing a meal, and it's inconvenient for us to spend more than 20 minutes, preparing a meal. And because of that, a lot of food we do eat either comes through a drive-through or it comes out of a package from our freezer, from our pantry. And so, so kind of taking a page from our ancestors and planning a little bit more time into our day to actually prepare food can make a big difference, not only in the quality of food you're eating, but when you put a lot of intention into the food that you're preparing, it just tastes better. And so, so that's one, a note we could take from our ancestors. Another thing for them, meats and sweets were a luxury, so there wasn't, especially when it came to sweets were only available really in the form of fruit, and fruits only ripe during certain times of the year. So for our ancestors, they had a huge availability of fruit toward the end of summertime, which was an advantage for them because fruit is really high in a type of sugar called fructose. And fructose gets processed in our body differently than other sugars because fructose is one of the sugars that is only used for energy in the liver. So your liver can use about 25 grams of fructose per day, but beyond that, your liver is going to take that fructose and it's going to store it as fat. So for our ancestors, because they mostly got sweets as fruit and fruit was only ripe at the end of summer, they would get a huge amount of fructose, which would help them put on weight at the end of summer, which that was the weight that would help sustain them over the winter time. So when you look at us today, and you look at not only the amount of fruit that we're eating all year round, because fruit is available at the grocery store all year round, but then you also look at a lot of the processed sugars we're eating, like high fructose corn syrup, which is about 65% fructose. And you can kind of start to see why we have such not only an obesity epidemic, but we also have an epidemic of what's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I don't know if anybody's heard of that before. If you know somebody that's had elevated liver enzymes and they're like, I don't drink any alcohol, I don't know why my liver's, having, a harder time. Most likely that is a result of too much sugar in their diet. And even another good marker for that is your lipid profile. So if you've had elevated cholesterol or elevated, bad cholesterol, the low density lipoproteins, if you've had elevated cholesterol and you're like, I don't eat a lot of red meat or a lot of cholesterol, but you have a high carbohydrate or high sugar diet, most likely those elevated lipid levels are due to too much sugar and an overload on the liver. And so, so that, again, for our ancestors was only available during certain times of the year. And so, so they didn't have the obesity problems like we have today. And then meat too, meat was kind of feast or famine. And, I'm actually not a huge proponent of a vegetarian or vegan diet. I do think most people actually do well with good quality animal proteins, but again, everything in moderation. And it's really more about the quality of the meat that you're getting versus the quantity. And then number 4, quantity of food was less. And there's actually a lot of really solid modern research to support the idea that the less you eat, the longer you live. Because every time we eat, you go through that whole process I talked about in the beginning of digesting your food, that puts a lot of stress on the body. And so, contrary to what we think, if you go, a day or you go 12 hours without eating, that's actually good for your body. It gives your body a little bit of a break. And so, a lot of people have started implementing something called intermittent fasting. I don't know if anybody's heard that term before, but it's basically where, you're only eating during a shorter window during the day. You eat, in about a 6-hour window, and then you fast, the rest of the 12 to 18 hours. And, that period of fasting gives your body a chance to kind of recover, and it gives your liver a chance to detoxify. And so that can be a real powerful tool to help with not only stabilizing blood sugar, but also, with, maintaining good detoxification systems. Question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. With this, so really, I mean, and this, you'll hear this multiple times, and I apologize for it, but it really depends on the person. So somebody who is used to eating a standard American diet, which is rich in carbohydrates, we'll talk about blood sugar here in just a little bit, but when you're eating a lot of carbohydrates and your blood sugar is up and down, you're going to feel hungry all the time. And so somebody whose blood sugar is up and down like that, especially initially when you're trying to stabilize the blood sugar, smaller meals frequently throughout the day is a really good thing. But as you start to get your blood sugar more and more stabilized, that's where you can start experimenting with going for longer periods fasting. But somebody who's used to eating the standard American diet, if you tried to ask them to do intermittent fasting, they would feel awful doing it because, I used to be that way. When I was in my 20s, I was a big runner. You know, I would run 6 to 8 miles a day. I was a vegetarian doing a high carbohydrate diet, and I was miserable. I was hungry all the time. And I just thought everybody was like that, you know, everybody, it was like I'd finish a meal and I was already thinking about what my next meal was going to be. And it was just, it was miserable. And it wasn't until I know I've got a strong family history of diabetes and insulin resistance. And so for me, as I started to figure out that, oh, wait a second, fat's not going to make me fat, and fat is actually really good for you. It's really good for stabilizing your blood sugar. The more I started to switch over to that sort of diet and give up a lot of the processed, you know, wheat, you know, processed grains. Now, almost every day I fast through breakfast, and I usually have my first meal like around 11 or 11:30, and I'm not hungry at all in the mornings. And so, whereas I used to be like within 5 to 10 minutes of waking up, I had to eat something. So breakfast, that's what they say. I know that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And it'll all make sense. Like when we start talking about blood sugar, we'll talk more about that because breakfast is really important. And not so much breakfast, but your first meal of the day is a really, really important meal. And so, and some people with the intermittent fasting, some people will eat breakfast and lunch and then they won't have dinner. So it just kind of depends on, you know, how you do it. But that it's definitely something that if you know, that a lot of people have found work really well to help stabilize blood sugar. So any other questions? Okay. And for anybody who came in, I told everybody at the beginning, if you have any questions, stop me, interrupt me, you know, even though I'm standing up here behind the podium because we're recording this, this is more informal. So if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so this brings us to really what this whole class is about. Like, what has changed in our modern diet that makes us so sick? Why is everybody dealing with some sort of chronic disease, some sort of inflammatory disease? And the answer is pretty simple, is it goes back to inflammation. Now, that's in some ways, you know, it's a little bit of a cop-out because inflammation is, you know, not necessarily something that's easy to define. But what we do know is that the food we're eating is triggering inflammation at higher levels than it's ever been in our past. So I like to ask this question just to kind of get a gauge for where people are at. But does anybody know what inflammation is and what inflammation actually does in the body? And no cheating, looking ahead in the notes. Any ideas? Anybody? What do you typically associate with inflammation? How does inflammation feel in the body? Burning, yes. Pain, swelling, heat. Those are typically the symptoms we associate with inflammation. But when you look at what inflammation is actually doing at a very, very basic level, inflammation's job is to break down damaged tissue. So when we have an injury, like you sprain your ankle, the reason it swells up and it gets painful and it gets hot and it gets red is because your body is triggered to release all these inflammatory mediators that go into that site. And you can kind of think of them like little Pac-Man. They start breaking down all of that tissue so that the body can come in behind it and heal. So that inflammatory process is actually a very, very important process in the body, because without that, we couldn't regenerate and heal. You know, we'd have a lot of, you know, scar tissue all over the body. So that inflammation is actually a very, very necessary process. So inflammation is healthy when it's localized, you know, so you have a localized injury and, you know, inflammation stays in that spot. When it's visible, you know, so you have all those symptoms like redness, heat, swelling, when you can see the signs of inflammation. And then the most important piece is when it's acute. You know, so the reason why when you sprain your ankle, they tell you to elevate it, ice it, wrap it, is you're trying to reduce that inflammatory response as quickly as possible. Because a little bit of inflammation is good, but too much inflammation is bad. Because if that inflammation sticks around longer than it should, you know, that sprained ankle that you have is going to continue to be in pain and you're going to continue to break down. And if you're continually breaking down that tissue, the body isn't going to be able to heal. So you need inflammation acutely, but then you want inflammation gone pretty quickly after you have an injury. So where inflammation becomes unhealthy is when sometimes it's systemic, you know, so sometimes you have inflammation all over the body. And when sometimes it's undetectable, so you don't necessarily feel the effects of inflammation. And most importantly, when inflammation becomes chronic, so if you, for instance, have arthritis, any itis condition is inflammation. So arthritis is inflammation in the joints. Dermatitis, which is eczema, inflammation of the skin, gastritis, inflammation in the stomach, gingivitis, inflammation in the gingiva of the teeth. Any itis condition is basically a fancy medical term for inflammation in an anatomical spot in the body. So when you have, for instance, arthritis, what's happening is you have a chronic inflammation in a joint that inflammation is continually breaking down that joint. And so because it's continually breaking it down, you're causing pain, you're going to break down that cartilage. Eventually, if you wear through all the cartilage, you're going to start wearing away at the bone. And so that breakdown process is continuous. And so when the body can't heal faster than that breakdown's happening, that's when you have chronic injury and chronic inflammation. So it's going to speed up, like I said, that wear and tear of different areas of the body or even different organ systems. Because another classic undetectable undetectable source of inflammation is in the arteries, cardiovascular disease. We've been very well programmed to believe that it is cholesterol that causes, cardiovascular disease. But in reality, when you look at what causes it, is it actually starts as inflammation in the lining of the arteries. So it's inflammation that starts breaking down, the lining of the arteries, and then cholesterol is transported in the blood. So that cholesterol gets deposited in the lining of the arteries. Whether that's intentional, maybe it's a healing mechanism in the body, or whether it's just a byproduct of, the cholesterol floating by. Regardless, it is the cholesterol that does end up constricting those blood vessels and creating, heart attacks or strokes or, cardiovascular issues, but it started as inflammation. And so that's why when you look at blood markers, cholesterol has not been shown to be a great predictor of a cardiovascular incident. I mean, it's pretty much 50-50, if you have elevated cholesterol or not. And in fact, one recent study actually showed that people who had higher cholesterol lived longer. So cholesterol is not the culprit here, inflammation is. And so you want to know a better risk factor for cardiovascular disease, it's a marker called C-reactive protein, or CRP. And even in traditional medicine, they use that as a marker for cardiovascular disease. And that's a much better predictor of, a cardiovascular incident in the long term if that stays elevated. So it is basically just a marker of systemic inflammation. So the key with inflammation is you want balance. So like I said, you do want to be able to turn on inflammation when you have an injury, but you want to have the mechanism to turn that inflammation off as soon as you can, as soon as that injury, has been taken care of. But what's happening in our world today is most people are stuck in this pro-inflammatory state to where they are just primed and ready, and it's very, very easy to trigger inflammation and very, very difficult to turn it off. And an analogy or an example I use to describe this is if you had two people that one person who was in this pro-inflammatory state, so they had a lot of inflammation in their body, versus somebody who's maybe more balanced, who doesn't have as much inflammation, and both of those people went out and hiked 8 miles. Hiking 8 miles creates wear and tear on your joints and your muscles and in your body. The person who's more pro-inflamed would go hike 8 miles. They'd be sore that night, and they'd probably be sore for 2 weeks after they did that hike. Versus the person who's more in a healthy inflammatory state would go hike 8 miles, trigger that inflammation, and maybe they're sore that night, maybe a little bit achy in the morning, but by the end of the second day, they feel fine. That's somebody that triggered inflammation did its job, and then it was gone. Versus this person triggered inflammation, and then that inflammation just kept going and going and going and going because they didn't have the mechanism to turn it off. And so that's kind of the difference, is that a lot of people in our world today are stuck in this pro-inflammatory state. And, I actually see a lot of our pediatric population, and I see a lot of kids today that are stuck in this state where their bodies are inflamed and they've got a lot of oxidative stress, and the kids have digestive issues, and they've got, eczema issues, and they've got all these inflammatory issues that go back to the fact that their body is inflamed. So what does inflammation have to do with the diet? You know, that's what we're here to connect those dots today. And when you look at, again, like I mentioned before, when you look at the ancestral diet, you know, our ancestors ate, you know, a certain way for thousands and thousands of years, you know, and that was what our digestive system evolved to be able to process and handle. But what you'll see is as we, as a society, went through different eras where we started adding in more, you know, agriculture, we started adding in more corn, more, you know, more of these grains into our diet, you know, you start to see changes in the inflammation levels in the body. And same thing, you know, as we went through the Industrial Revolution and then where we're at today in our convenience fast food revolution, each of these affected inflammation levels in the body. And so we'll talk more specifically about each of these here in just a second. But I'll mention right here on, if you have the booklet, or if not, I have on the slides here a few recommendations, book recommendations, movies. This book right here was one of my earliest and one of my favorites as far as kind of sparking this interest in nutrition. And so Michael Pollan is a wonderful nutrition writer, and he wrote this book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which talks all about this shift in our diet and how that's affected our health. And so, but to see how inflammation has changed, you know, during each of these different eras, we first have to connect what is it in our diet that we're eating that's creating more inflammation. So to connect what we're eating to inflammation, there are 4 major areas in the diet that connect with inflammation. And so I'm going to go through each of these and explain how they connect to inflammation. And then we're going to go through and see how each of these 4 factors have changed with each era, you know, and as our diet has evolved. So the 4 things we're going to look at that connect, you know, the diet with inflammation are what % of our diet comes from a whole food source. We're going to look at the ratio of omega-6 to 3 fatty acids, the glycemic index, you know, so this is looking at sugar, and then ORAC score. So this is looking at color in our foods. So the first concept here, eating whole foods. With this concept, if you don't get anything else from this class, if you understand this concept and you implement this concept, I always joke, this will cover a multitude of nutritional sins that you could potentially commit. If you can just eat whole foods, you're going to be doing better than 95% of people, you know, in our country today. Because, you know, a whole food is basically eating a food in its original state. You know, that a food that's been processed, where you take something away or where you know, alter that food significantly, you know, what that does, each step away from a whole food, you take away nutritional value from that food. So the example I have here, an apple, you know, an apple is a whole food. And if you were to eat an apple, you know, it's got all of the sugars, all the nutrients, all the fiber, everything in kind of one nice, neat package, kind of as nature designed it. But if you take that apple and you peel it, and you cook it down, you add sugar, you add cinnamon, you make applesauce. You know, applesauce is not a bad food choice at all. But we don't want to mistake ourselves into thinking that when we eat an applesauce, we're getting all the nutritional value of eating an apple, because it's lost quite a bit in that processing. Same thing if you go a couple steps, you know, to apple juice. You know, apple juice, you've taken away a lot of the fiber, you know, you've pasteurized it, taken away a lot of the nutrients that were in that apple to begin with. And so while, again, apple juice is probably a better choice than a lot of the things we could have, it's still nowhere close to just eating an apple. And so I give people the guide that if you could get at least 80% of your diet from whole foods, a whole food source, then that's doing great, you know. So I mean, kind of what does that look like? You know, that looks like, you know, as opposed to, you know, having your Cheerios for breakfast, it's having scrambled eggs, you know, with maybe some spinach in it. You know, for lunch, you know, rather than having that, you know, ham and cheese sandwich, you know, you're making a lettuce wrap, and maybe you're still putting that ham in it, you know, but you're buying organic cheese, and rather than just having the ham and cheese, you're adding some tomatoes, and you're, you know, maybe adding some spinach or some sprouts or something in there. You're adding more whole foods to that. Rather than just having your Lay's potato chips, you know, maybe you're having some vegetables, or maybe you're cooking your own sweet potatoes, you know, and bringing that as a side. Or maybe a snack, rather than having Cheetos or Doritos for a snack, you're bringing some nuts and seeds. And, that's kind of the shift that you start to make. And what I like about the 80-20 rule is you still have 20% that, if you really want something, 20% is still, a significant amount of, processed food that you can have. But focus, rather than just thinking about that 20%, focus on getting that 80%. And if you shift your focus to that, it becomes a whole different ball game, and it becomes a lot easier. Now, I will say it is more expensive. Buying, mixed nuts is more expensive than buying, Cheez-Its, I've had the question before, people say, well, why is it so expensive to eat healthy and it's not in my budget? And, I always like to shift that question and ask, not why is it so expensive to eat healthy, but why is it so inexpensive to eat processed food? And that's the better question, because our food industry is all about making food cheaper, but when you use cheap ingredients in food, then you're going to have to use things to make those cheap ingredients taste good. And the food industry has gotten really, really good at putting the right amount of fat, processed trans fats in foods, to where it's just enough, to where we can eat a lot, or enough flavoring that or enough sugar that it's not too much sugar that we don't want to keep eating it, but it's just enough that we can sit down and eat that whole bag of cookies, and not necessarily feel the effects of it. And so don't mistake the fortification, the nutrients that they're putting back in food do not replace the nutrients that were stripped out when they processed that food to begin with. And so the more you can get your nutrients from real food and from whole foods, the better off you're going to be and the better off you're going to feel. Yeah. Fiber back in. I mean, it depends on the type of fiber they're putting back in. I mean, again, the food industry, if you always keep in mind that it's a business, which I don't fault them for this at all, but being a business, they're going to try and use the cheapest ingredients possible, taste the best, to last the longest on the shelf, and so taking all those factors into consideration, most companies, most of your big companies are not taking into account what is the healthiest form of fiber, or, what is the best, form that's going to be best for our digestive system. And so you're really much better off just getting fiber in fruits and vegetables, and in a whole food source, rather than relying on what's been fortified in foods. So, and it is interesting, because the food companies, again, when you look at how they've processed, for instance, wheat, they have stripped away so much of wheat, to make the flour that they use, that they go back and they add folic acid and they add iron, but they're adding the wrong forms of that stuff back in. So the type of folic acid they put in foods, 60% of the population can't process that form of folic acid. And so the type of folic acid we can process is in leafy greens. And so, if you're relying just on your fortified grains for folic acid, 60% of the population isn't going to be able to utilize that very efficiently. And so same thing with iron, iron, the type of iron they use just goes right through you. It's non-digestible, but it does create an inflammatory response, in the digestive system. And so I don't want to make a blanket statement that all companies are bad, because not all companies are bad, but I think it's safe to assume most of the big food companies don't have our interest at heart. And that's fine. One thing I think that's really powerful is, if you think about how you spend your money as you're voting, and you're supporting the companies that do have good practices, that do, process food in a healthy, sustainable way, that's powerful. And especially, I would say now more so than ever in our recent history, is that making a difference? Big companies are starting to change their ways. They're going non-GMO. They're taking food dyes, out. They're taking high fructose corn syrup out, because people aren't buying that stuff anymore, which I think is really great. So, but if you can get, like I said, 80%, shoot, what? Oh, yes, sure. I know. It's tough. There's a lot of politics, I think, behind it because, the FDA also approved the use of glyphosate, which they've just now recently this year gone back and said is a carcinogen. But it's like you look at the European countries and they never approved the use of it. And so there's politics, big agriculture is a real powerful lobbying force. And so, so I think I think, too, I think sometimes the focus is more on feeding our population, rather than more sustainable farming. I actually just read a statistic recently that just in Sedgwick County, if the kind of the gross amount spent on food is around $1 billion. And so if everybody just spent 5% of their budget here locally, that would be a $54 million boost to our economy here locally. So I mean, even little things like that. There are some great farmers markets. The Old Town Farmers Market, they just opened that up to where that's now open year round. They have an indoor market. And so finding local farmers, that you can support, that it is, like I said, it is a bit more expensive than just buying stuff at the grocery store. But, if you can eat more sustainably and if you can support local farmers, and you're going to, feel better eating what's in season, but not only that, but also could be beneficial for our local economy. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry. Yes, just a second.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Did you have a question online?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I couldn't get in your program early, but 30 minutes. So I missed 30 minutes. My question to you, how much it usually costs to buy food for one person for per week, per month?
Well, I mean, a lot just depends on how you eat and what you eat. There are ways to eat very economically and still eat whole foods. A lot to, a lot is buying things on sale. I've actually found a local farmer that, I buy, it's pasture raised, pasture finished meat that's $5.50 a pound, for ground beef, for steaks, for chicken, for everything. And so, I mean, I was just at Dillon's yesterday, and I mean, unless you buy the real inexpensive stuff, buying a quality meat, is going to be close to that, especially for steaks. And so a lot just depends on. I think there's a lot you can do within your budget, and still eat, whole foods. And part of it goes
Well,
back
I
to
don't know.
beginning, eating a little bit less too.
Well, because I have had blood cancer because 95% is nutrition deficiency, and I'm on Social Security at the moment right now, and I'm just trying to figure out what is usually out. I live in California. California is different cancer. I was just wondering, for one person, it's normal average like $100 a week. I mean, or the $400 a month or $300 a month average. I wasn't really sure.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on where you live. You know, I'll say this. I mean, I've got 3 kids and a husband, so there's 5 of us in our family, and you know, we probably spend, you know, and we eat like almost mostly organic, you know, pasture raised meat, and for our family of 5, I mean, we spend about $200 a week, you know, on groceries. So I would say $100 for one person should be more than enough to be able to eat, you know, to eat a good whole foods diet.
I see. But buy people 200, that's pretty good. But one person, I'm trying to figure out California price. So I guess maybe I have to figure out maybe 75. I have to figure out in number wise. Okay, I appreciate you answered that question
Absolutely.
anyway. So go on with
Absolutely.
your
Okay.
lecture.
Okay. So the next thing, as far as, you know, if you can get, like I said, 80% of your diet from whole foods, that will cover just about everything else we're going to talk about. But um, getting a little bit more into specifics, if you look at, um, there we go. The next thing that connects diet with inflammation is omega-3s versus omega-6s. So I apologize for the biochemistry. Anybody that knows me, you know I'm a huge nerd, and so I had to slip a little bit of this in there because I always like people to know that when, you know, when we see patients, this is what's going on in our head when we're, you know, talking through different recommendations. And so when you look at what we're looking at here is the breakdown of omega-3 fatty acids versus omega-6. And most people have heard of omega-3s, you know, fish oil, you know, we know we're supposed to get, you know, more omega-3s. But both omega-3s and omega-6s are what are known as essential fatty acids. And they're called essential fatty acids because we have to get these fats in our diet. You know, so we can't make these fats in our body, you know, from the building blocks of our food. We have to get these in our diet. So your omega-6s primarily come from plant-based sources. So corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, you know, all of those are high in omega-6s. And so when we get a diet that's high in omega-6s, those fatty acids go through this conversion process into something called arachidonic acid, which that gets converted into these pro-inflammatory mediators. They're prostaglandins and leukotrienes. But basically, all you need to know is these are the guys that when we have an injury, these are the guys that get triggered to turn on inflammation in the body. So the more of these you have, the easier it is to trigger inflammation and the harder it is to turn that inflammation off. Versus omega-3 fatty acids, you know, these are primarily from fish. You know, that's the best source of omega-3s. But you can also get them from some plants like flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, hemp seeds, you know, grass-fed. You know, so your pasture-raised meat. One of the reasons why that is so much healthier for you is the fat that you get from this meat is much higher in omega-3 fatty acids. And so, and then also, you know, if you have chickens that are pasture-raised chickens, the eggs that come from those pasture-raised chickens are going to be much higher in omega-3s because what they're eating, the grasses and the animals and the seeds are much higher in omega-3s. So when you eat a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, those get turned into something called EPA and DHA, which then are turned into these guys, which are anti-inflammatory. So they turn off inflammation. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
So if you said if you're allergic to which ones? The omega-6s? Are you allergic to all of these? Oh, your kids are. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, with omega-6s, you do need omega-6s. And so, I mean, that's why they're circled in red up here, not because they're all bad, but because we over consume them. And so, I mean, if you're allergic to those, I mean, most people don't have a problem getting omega-6s because even things like almonds have omega-6s in them. Walnuts, even though walnuts are higher in omega-3s, they still have omega-6s in them. And so if you're eating a whole foods diet, then they're not. Yeah, they react to all of those. Yeah, so I mean, we'd have to look at their specific diet and see, but ideally what you want is a balance between the two. But the reason omega-6s are highlighted in red is because we tend to overconsume omega-6s in the standard American diet. Because if you look at processed food, you know, if you go down the chip aisle and you look at all the Pringles and Lay's potato chips and Doritos, all of them are cooked in these oils. If you look at salad dressings, if you even a lot of the healthy foods that you healthy processed foods, they're cooked in these oils. And so we tend to have way more omega-6s and not enough omega-3 fatty acids. And so we actually measure this at the Reardon Clinic, and we measure the different breakdown products. And I would say on average, most of the patients I see are anywhere between about 15 to 20 times the amount of omega-6s versus omega-3s. Now, I've seen people 40 to 1 difference. I've never seen a 1 to 1, which is the ideal ratio. I think the best I've seen is a 3 to 1. You know, but most people in our world today have way more omega-6 fatty acids because they're eating a processed diet. Now, again, I always tell people, go back to rule number 1. And if you're eating 80% whole foods, most whole foods, you know, from nature have a good balance of omega-6s to omega-3s. And so if you're eating a whole foods diet, chances are pretty good that this is going to be balanced. And I use myself as an example because last year when we do our staff blood draws once a year, I intentionally was not taking a fish oil because I wanted to see what my ratio would look like just eating, you know, the diet that we do. And my family, just to let you, we go through about 24 eggs a week. So we eat a ton of eggs, you know, that have a lot of omega-3s in them. We do the grass-fed meat, and my ratio was 5 to 1. And so without taking a fish oil supplement, I thought that was pretty good, you know, just eating more of a whole foods sort of diet. So it is possible to get that ratio balanced, just focusing on getting a lot of these foods in your diet. Now, one thing that's interesting, you know, that I feel like, you know, this class is, you know, food is medicine. And one really, really cool example of how food truly is medicine is when you look at this pathway right here. So there's an enzyme right here called cyclooxygenase, which you'll see this enzyme highlighted in blue on this side. It's also highlighted in blue on this side. Now, what's interesting is if you've ever taken an Advil, or you've ever taken, you know, Tylenol, any of what are called NSAID drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The other name for those drugs is they're called COX inhibitors. And the reason they're called COX inhibitors is how they help with your pain is they knock out this enzyme right here. So when you take that Advil and you stop, and your body stops, you know, making this cyclooxygenase, you stop making so much of this prostaglandin, and so you turn down inflammation, which is good. You know, in the short term, that's a great effective tool for decreasing inflammation. Now, long-term use of some of those drugs, you're not only affecting this side of the equation, but you're also affecting this side of the equation because you're also knocking out this enzyme. So you're also knocking out this anti-inflammatory prostaglandin on this side. And so, you know, that's why long-term use of some of those is discouraged, and why long-term use of, say, like aspirin and stuff can cause, you know, irritation to the lining of the stomach. But what I think is so cool about this is, I mean, food is medicine. So if you really want to have the same effect on your pain as taking, you know, an Advil, the best thing to do is to decrease, you know, intake of these omega-6 fatty acids and increase intake of these omega-3 fatty acids. And you're going to have the same effect without, you know, and in fact, you're going to actually build up this anti-inflammatory prostaglandin on this side. And so over the long term, you'll decrease your pain and you'll also feel a whole lot better. So that's one kind of tiny example of how food truly is medicine. And you know, where, you know, when you look at drugs, most drugs, the way they work is they knock out certain enzymes, you know, in certain biochemical pathways, but you can't knock out one enzyme without it affecting something else, which is why drugs have the whole litany of side effects that they do. And so one other thing too, before we move on, one other small point I'll make is that you have to be aware of not only the food that you're eating that's, you know, high in omega-3s or omega-6 fatty acids, but also the food that you're eating, what that food ate. So for instance, if you're eating corn-fed cows, you know, corn-fed cows are going to have a lot of omega-6 fatty acids in their fats. So, this whole idea of, if you have cardiovascular disease, you need to decrease your intake of red meat. Is it truly the red meat that's creating that cardiovascular disease, which is what we now know, is inflammation related? Or is it the fact that you're eating poor quality meat that's triggering that inflammation? Versus investing in grass-fed meat, which is higher in omega-3s, could actually have the opposite effect and could actually help decrease your inflammation. And so, so really being mindful of the quality of the animal proteins, not only the animal proteins, but also the dairy that you're consuming. If you consume a lot of dairy, even the organic stuff you buy at the store is better, but a lot of times when it's organic, they've just been fed organic corn. It's not necessarily they're fed grass-fed, grass-fed, they're fed grass. And so you might, again, I encourage the organic over not, but it's still not necessarily going to be higher in omega-3s versus omega-6s.
I have a question.
Yes, what's your question?
I want to know if I heard you right at the beginning of that particular topic about omega-3, omega-6. Did you say about our body cannot make omega-3, omega-6? Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, they're essential
and you
fatty
don't
acids.
Say that again?
They're essential fatty acids.
Right. I didn't realize that until you mentioned that. I didn't know that. So I'm trying to make that right. I had breast cancer. So I'm saying because our body does not make omega-3 and omega-6, and if I don't feed my body the omega-3 or omega-6, I probably ate more omega-6, which is probably high. And I'm working with somebody right now, health coach in my omega-3, omega-6. She said my cell membrane is very high. It cannot absorb the nutrient food right now. Mm-hmm. So I'm working on a fish oil to get better balance. And in America, we have a very high omega-6 instead of omega-3, right?
Correct.
So how long it takes?
It depends on the person. It depends on, how well you can absorb a lot of this stuff. I mean, I've seen people change their ratio fairly quickly. And I've seen, like, for instance, that inflammation marker, I've seen that change fairly quickly for people. So it doesn't always take a long time to change some of this stuff, but sometimes it takes, it's finding what works well for you, because, everybody's a little bit different with what works well for them. So
what I want to know, if I didn't have, because we don't make our omega-3, omega-6 in our body, and if I don't help my body with omega-3, omega in the right balance, if I don't do that, is that when it become inflammation after that?
What happens is, if you're not intentionally working on it, you're going to get omega-3s and 6s from what you're eating, because they're in most foods have, these fats in them. And so if you're not intentional though about getting omega-3s and you're getting a lot more omega-6s, what that does is it's easier to trigger inflammation. So it's kind of like, you can think about, the pro-inflammatory mediators that are made from omega-6s, make it such that, that it's easier to trigger it, kind of like, if you, for instance, the example I gave of, most of us do things on a daily basis that create wear and tear in the body. And so if you have more omega-6s, when you create that wear and tear and you trigger that inflammation, it flares a lot more and it's harder to turn that inflammatory signal off.
Right. And because I have an unusual challenge with nutrient food by itself alone, that's another matter, because that's why it's not a stormy. But now it sounds like I have to buy food to see what food can help me and what food cannot help me. I said that's what it looked like.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, then the next slide here. So the third thing, so we've looked at whole foods, getting 80% whole foods in the diet, more omega-3s, versus omega-6s. Both of those can reduce inflammation. But the third major thing that connects diet with inflammation is blood sugar. And this is a really, really important piece to understand, not only your metabolism, but to also understand a lot of your endocrine function, a lot of your hormone signaling. And so when you look at, the standard American diet, most Americans are much heavier on carbohydrates versus fats and protein. We all kind of grew up in the 80s where fats were bad. And, that was programmed into our head that if you eat a lot of fats that you're going to get fat. And so, by virtue of that, the food companies started putting a lot of sugar in foods because, fats and sugars taste good to us. If both of those are missing, food isn't going to taste very good. And so, so what happens is when you eat a high carbohydrate food or a high sugar food, like I said, that goes down into your stomach, it gets broken down, things that are simple sugars like table sugar, those sugars get broken down very quickly, and that glucose gets released into the bloodstream. And when glucose gets released into the bloodstream, its job is to transport that glucose all over the body. But that glucose is stuck in the blood until a hormone called insulin comes into play, because insulin is what grabs that glucose, grabs that sugar, and puts it into our cells. So it puts it into our skin cells, our muscle cells, our liver cells, our brain cells. Those cells cannot get sugar without insulin. So what happens when we have a real high carbohydrate, real high sugar meal is that sugar gets released into the bloodstream, and what starts to increase is our blood sugar. So this is the pattern of what it looks like when we have a high glycemic or a high carbohydrate or a high sugar meal. So that sugar very quickly gets into the bloodstream and it builds up. Now, the body doesn't like sugar being very high in the blood, because the more sugar there is, the thicker and more viscous the blood is. So the body is programmed that as it senses that sharp increase in blood sugar, the body releases insulin. Now, with this sharp of an increase, the body's going to dump a lot of insulin because it's preparing for a large sugar load. So when we get to the top of the peak right here, this is where insulin starts to kick in. And so insulin starts to pull all that sugar out of the bloodstream. And so because a ton of insulin was dumped, that sugar gets pulled out very quickly. So this is that, you have a candy bar and you feel really good and like your brain's firing and you've got energy. And then this right here is where you crash. And all of a sudden you're low energy. Maybe you feel lethargic, you feel irritable, you feel shaky, or what some people call hangry. You're so hungry, you get angry. So when you have this sort of a pattern with your blood sugar, what happens very often is insulin does its job so well that it actually pulls too much sugar out, and you actually get what's called hypoglycemia. So this is where your blood sugar goes too low. And this is where you're so hungry you'll eat it you can get your hands on. And so, so this sort of a pattern is the pattern that most people exist in. So they eat a lot of sugar, high carbohydrate, blood sugar spikes, insulin gets dumped, blood sugar drops. Blood sugar drops, they get hungry, they look for something quick energy, so sugar, carbohydrates, and blood sugar goes back up. And so all day long, their blood sugar is going up and down like this. And what eventually starts to happen, you do this for, 20 plus years, eventually your cells stop responding to insulin. So your body will dump all this insulin, and then, insulin tries to pull the sugar out of the blood, but it can't get the sugar into your cells because your cells stop responding to it. So your blood sugar doesn't go down as far as it used to. And then you spike it again, it doesn't go down as far. And then eventually when you hit about this level right here, about 120 fasting blood sugar, that's where you are given the diagnosis of prediabetes, you're put on metformin, and you're kind of on your way to developing, insulin resistance and diabetes. And so but that's why diabetes is one of the most preventable diseases, because this sort of a pattern, this insulin dump and this drop in blood sugar and spiking in blood sugar, that is what leads to insulin resistance, and that is reversible. There's one of the best ways to stop stressing that system so much is to eat foods that are more low glycemic foods. So low glycemic foods are going to be foods that are high in protein, foods that are high in fat, foods that are high in fiber. So your vegetables, your animal proteins and your fats are going to be low glycemic foods. And the reason they're low glycemic is to get the energy out of those foods, it takes a whole lot longer for the body to break down those foods. So rather than a ton of glucose getting dumped all at once, it's more slowly released into the system. And since it's more slowly released into the system, then, the body more slowly releases insulin. And so because it more slowly releases insulin and you don't get this huge dump of insulin, insulin more slowly pulls that energy out of the bloodstream. And so you get this sort of a pattern where it's kind of like a nice rolling increase in blood sugar and then a nice decrease. So that rather than getting to this point where you're hangry, you get to this point where, your blood sugar is back down to a normal level and you're like, yeah, I think I'm ready for lunch. It's not that, I'm going to eat whatever you put in front of me. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm hungry. I could eat, and that's a more healthy state to be. And that's what we were talking about in the beginning. Most people, when they're on this roller coaster ride, if you all of a sudden take food away from them, they're going to tank and they're going to go hypoglycemic and they're going to be miserable and they're going to be shaky and they're not going to feel good because their body isn't responding to insulin as well. And so what you have to do is if you're hyper and hypoglycemic, you have to slowly transition your diet more to a low glycemic diet. And the more low glycemic you get, the less hungry you're going to be. And the less hungry you're going to be and the more stable your body can keep your blood sugar, then the better you'll be able to go for periods without eating and fasting. And so you kind of have to work up, most people kind of have to work up to that point though. Because, one thing, I'll kind of go off on a tangent here because I think it's applicable. Most people don't realize that when you look at our metabolism, if you think about metabolism like an engine that burns fuel in our body, we really have two engines. We have two dual metabolisms. We have one engine that burns sugar for fuel, and we have one engine that burns fat for fuel. Now, the rules of these engines are if you eat sugar, the body is always going to default and it's always going to burn that first because sugar is a quick burn. It's an easy burn. We feel really good when we eat sugar. But fat is kind of more like a diesel fuel. It's more sustainable, long lasting, long burning, and, over time it'll sustain you longer. And so what happens for most people is when we go to bed at night, especially if you eat your last meal, around 6 or 7 o'clock, you go to bed at night, about 5 hours after you go to sleep, your body's going to burn through all the glucose, all the glycogen it has stored. So that every night we go into this fat burning mode where we start using our fat burning engine for fuel because the body has to pull stored fat so that we can sleep for, 8 hours without waking up. And so what happens for a lot of people is we wake up in the morning and we're burning fat for fuel. And then all of a sudden we eat this high carbohydrate meal. So we eat this high carbohydrate meal that spikes your blood sugar. Your body switches into that sugar burning engine. And so when you're burning sugar for fuel, when you run out of sugar, your body wants more sugar and it craves more. And so you're going to be hungry and you're going to crave more carbohydrates. Versus if you use your fat burning engine, especially in the morning, and you stay in that fat burning mode, your body can see when you run out of fat, or even if you fast in the morning, when your body needs energy, it can very easily pull stored fat and burn that for energy. So you'll be more lean over time because your body will burn stored fat, and you won't get those drops in blood sugar during the day that a lot of people get. And so, but you do have to train your body, and it can take, anywhere from, 2 to 4 weeks to really get your body into that fat burning mode, especially if you're used to burning carbohydrates. And so when your body's used to burning fat, your blood sugar will stay more like this. It'll stay a whole lot more steady rather than, peaking and valleying throughout the day. And that first meal, why breakfast is considered, a really important meal, because the first meal you have of the day, I kind of equate it to like a roller coaster ride, that very first, steep hill and then that decline. That is what sets the momentum for the rest of the day. So if you have a real high carbohydrate breakfast and then your blood sugar drops, the first thing you're going to crave is more sugar, which is going to put you right back up. And so, so what you have at the beginning of the day really influences how your blood sugar reacts the rest of the day. So
I have a question.
Yes.
So we better off eating low glycemic food.
Right. Yep. You'd be better off doing
Okay.
low glycemic food.
Okay. And something that got my attention, what you say about something about the cell stop cannot process the nutrient is because of too much sugar.
Too much sugar causes insulin resistance. Yes, it causes your cells to stop responding to insulin.
Wow. So I didn't realize the cells stopped it absorbing nutrient because of too much sugar that resisted the insulin. Is that right?
Right. Right.
Oh, I have a feeling I might have done that to my body. So that kind of makes sense because I used to have a hyperglycemia. So I never really corrected that problem a long time ago. So it
Right.
finally gave up. So that I appreciate that, hearing that. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So then, let's see. So we're gonna, okay, so here we go. So we're gonna jump into, oh, sorry, one more thing, ORAC score. So when you look at the ORAC score, this is the fourth thing that connects the diet with inflammation. And so when you look at the ORAC score, that's basically a fancy way of saying how much color does food have, in it. And so foods that have more color, like your leafy greens, your berries, they're going to have more nutritional value. They're going to have more phytonutrients because it's the color in those foods that help protect them from the harmful UV rays of the sun. So those plants are going to afford more protection for us, more antioxidant power for us. And so those are real protective against inflammation in the body. And so I always laugh and joke that, like, when I'm making dinner and I'm cutting foods up and they're staining my hands, like, cutting a sweet potato and my fingers are orange, or beets, those are really good, high color, high ORAC, no foods, and those are some of the best. Those are all of the superfoods that we hear about, your broccoli, your sweet potatoes, your berries, your blueberries, all of those are really good for you. And so, if anybody got, I don't know if anybody got the booklet for the class. At the back of the booklet, or even if you didn't, we have it, I think, as a handout upstairs. One of the best ways to get a lot of colors in your diet, besides just having a salad, is do a smoothie. So berries, you can throw in, mixed berries. You can throw in a handful of spinach. You can throw in nuts and seeds. All of that, can be, a great way to get all of these superfoods kind of in one meal. And it's real easy, especially during the summertime. And if you throw in enough, good fats like, coconut oil, seeds and nuts, nut proteins, all of that can be a meal replacement. Most of the time we think of smoothies as like just fruit and juice, which is not, a great option because that's going to, spike your blood sugar. But if you get enough greens in there and enough of good fats and proteins, that will help keep your blood sugar a lot more stable. All right, so now we're going to jump in those four things we talked about: the amount of whole foods, 80% whole foods in the diet, omega-6 versus omega-3s, the glycemic index, and color foods. All of those influence inflammation in the body. And so now we're going to kind of take a look at how those things stack up in the ancestral diet versus when we introduce grains versus our diet today. And so when you look at the ancestral diet, this is not well defined, but it's basically when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, when they, foraged for food, they ate a lot of plant matter, a lot of roots, fruits, berries, a lot of, meat and protein. And from the, what we know, these people rarely experience degenerative and inflammatory disease. Now, the counter argument to that is, the life expectancy around this time was 30 to 35, and most people don't have a lot of inflammation before that time anyways. But the kind of the counter argument to that is, like I said, I see a lot of kids today that have signs of inflammation. They don't always feel it like adults do because, like I said, inflammation breaks down tissue. In kids, their bodies rebuild that tissue so quickly that they don't always feel the effects of inflammation in the same way that adults do. 30 is about the time where your body stops repairing itself as well as it did when you were young. And that's typically around the time where people start to feel more aches and pains, and they start to feel the effects of inflammation that they've probably had for quite some time. They just weren't aware of it. And so, so we have a lot of early signs of degenerative and inflammatory disease much earlier than we've ever had, in previous history. And so when you look at the ancestral diet, they got 100% of their foods from a whole food source. They didn't have any other options. So they were eating 100% whole foods. Because they were eating 100% whole foods, they had a perfect 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s. So they could turn on inflammation and turn it off, very efficiently. Their glycemic index was very low because they were mostly eating lean meats and fish and plant matter. So very low glycemic index. And their ORAC score was very high because they were eating a lot of color. So when you look at the ancestral diet, as far as inflammation goes, it was pretty balanced. And what balanced all of it were all these factors that we talked about. So the ancestral diet is kind of what our bodies were designed to use for fuel. And so, as you'll see, things have shifted quite radically from this sort of a profile, but this right here is what our bodies and our digestive system was designed to use as the best source of fuel. Now, when you get into the agricultural revolution, again, this is not a well-defined time period. And, I actually just read a really great book called The Plant Paradox. It's not written down on here, but it's a great one by Dr. Stephen Gundry. And he talks about how it was about 10,000 years ago that we really started introducing a lot of grains. And it was during that time period that we actually lost height, we lost stature. And so, but again, there were benefits to being able to grow grains because we could be less nomadic. We could stay in one spot, so Egypt is a great example of this sort of society. But even in ancient Egypt, when they dig up the remains of, the people, the mummified, kings and whatnot, pharaohs, they had a lot of decay. They had a lot of, degeneration in their bones. So they had a lot of signs of inflammation even during that time period. And so, the more people became reliant on grains, the more that started to shift them to a bit more of a pro-inflammatory state. So when you look at this time period, again, still about 90% whole foods, so you're still getting a lot of good whole foods compared to today. Omega-6 to 3 ratios, just a little bit of a shift, 5-to-1, so a little bit more shift toward the pro-inflammatory states. Glycemic index, again, not as great because grains are higher on the glycemic index. And then ORAC score, not as great because you're replacing some of the vegetable matter with grains. And so during this time period, you see just a slight shift more toward a pro-inflammatory state, nothing too major. But where the biggest shift happened was kind of during this Industrial Revolution period. And again, this isn't a distinct defined time period, but how I define this time period is this is when food became a business. So rather than food being just to sustain us, all of a sudden businesses got involved and they started trying to figure out how can we make this cheaper? How can we make this last longer on the shelf? How can we make this taste better? And so when you're going more for those factors, they started to make decisions about food, like they started to refine grains, because when you refine out the wheat germ, it lasts longer on the shelf and it tastes better. White bread tastes better to most people. Same thing with sugar. Refining the sugar makes it last longer, makes it taste better. They started to introduce margarine and separated the fats because, again, they lasted longer on the shelves. And so, what you see is a lot of, replacing the nutrient-dense foods that people were used to with refined foods. And, what's interesting is if anybody's ever heard of the Weston A. Price Foundation, Weston A. Price was a dentist, and, he's got some really interesting research on looking at indigenous cultures that were introduced to this Western sort of diet within one generation. And he showed changes, just within one generation. You look at one generation that's, close to 6 foot, and the next generation is, 5'6", 5'7". He looked at jaw lines and, cranial shapes. And what he saw was without, certain nutrients, there was a narrowing of the palate and there was a change in the jaw shape. And, it's interesting today because if you talk to any dentist or orthodontist, they're going to say every kid of this generation is going to need braces because all kids are crowded. And a lot of the reason they're crowded is kids very, very often today have a narrowing of the palate. And so they have a high arched palate. You see a lot of kids today, with those helmets on because they've got a lot of cranial malformations because they're not opening, their cranium isn't opening up. And a lot of that, according to the Weston A. Price, can be traced back to the nutrient density that they're getting in the foods that especially that mom was eating during pregnancy and what's in the breast milk. And so, so when you look at, this sort of a time period, I kind of think of this around like post World War I, World War II era. And, and again, not to discount this because there is a lot of really great benefits to having convenience in food. You talk to, like, my grandma's 87 years old and she's just wonderful. And she grew up on a farm here in Kansas with nine sisters. And I can remember vividly about 5 years ago, I was telling her about how we were growing a garden and we're going to can all the tomatoes and make tomato sauce. And she just looked at me totally perplexed. And she was like, Annie, she's like, you can buy canned tomatoes at the grocery store for 99 cents. She's like, why would you go through all the trouble of growing it and canning it? And in her mind, she remembers when they had to do that, and that was their reality. And so, the whole convenience factor, especially for women, opened up a lot of opportunities and a lot of possibilities outside the home. So not to discount that, but I think what was lost during this time period is us questioning, well, what is really in our foods? If we are relying more and more on these food companies for our food and our food source, what are we actually getting for that? So when you look at this time period, Industrial Revolution period, 65% of the diet from whole foods. A lot of people were still eating at home during this time period. So, again, still higher percentage than it is today. A big shift in the omega-6 to 3 ratio, now 10-1, much more, again, all those refined grains people are eating more of, is shifting more to that omega-6 direction. Glycemic index is high, because again, refining sugar, refining grains, that's making them even higher on the glycemic index. And then ORAC score is very low because again, you're replacing a lot of the vegetable matter, with processed grains. One comment, kind of a side note, looking at the glycemic index, with wheat today, wheat has been hybridized and modified so many different times. And today wheat, it's a heavier head of wheat than we've ever had before, but it's also a higher starch content. So on the glycemic index, wheat is at the same level as cane sugar today. So wheat will spike your blood sugar the same as having sugar because of how high the starch content is in it. So you do have to be careful as far as if you're looking at regulating blood sugar, you really have to look at cutting out a lot of the processed grains because they are so processed, they can have a pretty significant impact on your blood sugar. And, with blood sugar, one thing I will say, everybody's a little bit different. Like I mentioned, I have a strong family history of diabetes. And so I'm very sensitive to things that are, high in sugar, high in starches. And so some people might be able to have a breakfast of oatmeal and a banana. And, that would be, especially if it's slow cooking, real oatmeal, that would be considered a pretty healthy breakfast. But for me, if I eat a breakfast like that, come 10 o'clock, I'm going to be hungry and I'm going to be looking for food because that spikes my blood sugar. And because I'm already in that, insulin resistant because of my genetics, that sort of a meal is too much. It's too much of a glycemic load for me. White potatoes are too much of a glycemic load for me. Whereas other people, that might not be an issue. So, use your hunger as a cue. If you eat something for breakfast and you're hungry a few hours later, either you didn't eat enough or you ate something that was too high glycemic for you. And so that's a good way to kind of gauge how well you're doing. So this is, again, during this time period, the Industrial Revolution, we're getting more and more into this pro-inflammatory state. And then all these things right here that protect us against inflammation are getting smaller and smaller. Till we get to today. Today we're in what we would consider a convenience fast food revolution, widespread refining, processing. Food science is an entire industry. It's a booming industry. It's a major in college. You can major in ag food science. Very high refined carbohydrates, low intake of vegetables, foods that our body has never seen before. Hydrogenated, trans fats, that's a man-made invention. Certain chemical preservatives, stuff like BHA, BHT, the nitrates, all of those are chemical preservatives to make foods last longer. One good way to tell if you should be eating a food or not is if you put it out on your counter and it still looks the same, really even about a week or week and a half after you put it out, chances are it's probably not the best thing. Either it's got a lot of preservatives in it or it's not a real food. And so, but those chemicals are widely used in our world today. One ingredient that isn't talked about a lot that I like to highlight is natural and artificial flavorings. If you have a processed food at home, flip over the package and chances are good, it's one of the most commonly used ingredients today, but chances are pretty good that processed food has natural or artificial flavorings in it. And what that is the food industry back in the late 70s figured out how to chemically replicate flavor. So classic example of this is vanilla, vanilla versus vanilla extract. Pure vanilla has some medicinal properties to it. It's got an ORAC score. It actually does something to benefit your body, versus imitation vanilla is just the flavor of vanilla. So they chemically learned to replicate that vanilla, and then they made this syrup out of it. And so that imitation vanilla, it's probably not going to hurt you. These artificial flavorings aren't necessarily bad, and there's usually not a ton of them, but where they really throw things off is your brain and your body is programmed to attach flavor with nutritional value. What gives a food flavor in nature are the nutrients. So in a carrot, what gives a carrot the flavor of a carrot are carotenoids in that carrot. And so if you start chemically replicating flavor and you spray that flavoring on a chip that has no nutritional value to it, your brain is thinking it's getting something that it's not. And so when you eat that chip and you don't get any nutrients from it, your brain's like, oh, I probably just need more. So you eat more, that's part of the reason why, if you sit down and you start eating a few Pringles, you could go through that whole stack of Pringles, probably no problem without, your body telling you to stop. And so, but you try and do that same thing, with a whole food. You try and sit down and eat a whole bag of carrots, you'll eventually get to a point where your body says, enough, I'm good. And so, so these artificial flavorings are sneaking into all of the foods that we're eating, and it's elevating this threshold of flavor so that when we go to eat real food, you go to eat a salad, it doesn't taste very good. You go to eat vegetables, it doesn't taste good unless you douse it with ranch or you douse it with all this flavoring. And part of that is your brain's attenuation to flavor. And so I tell parents, especially, this is so important for kids, that, a lot of kids come out and they're put on formula, which formula has artificial flavorings in it, has corn syrup solids in it. And then they're transitioned to, flavor blasted goldfish and all these different processed foods that have all these artificial flavors. And so parents go to give their kids vegetables, and lo and behold, the kid doesn't want vegetables. They don't taste good. And so to really get kids, and this works for adults too, back to eating real food, you've got to cut out all the foods that have these artificial flavorings in them. And I've heard this time and time again with so many patients, that you cut all that food out, you cut out all those artificial flavorings, and all of a sudden real food starts tasting good. And they all of a sudden start craving. We have one patient that she all of a sudden started craving Brussels sprouts, and she could eat a whole bag of Brussels sprouts a day, So, it's like you start craving real food again. And one other kind of side note is, just because you're cutting out these artificial flavorings doesn't mean food has to taste bad. I strongly encourage, use fresh herbs, use fresh spices, use the pink Himalayan sea salt. I tell people, don't worry about salting your food if you're using the pink Himalayan sea salt, because that's not going to affect your blood pressure in the same way that table salt affects your blood pressure. And so, so you want to use the real food to flavor it, and use fat, use olive oil. My kids will eat just about any vegetable if I put olive oil and sea salt on it and roast it. So yeah. It's just the mineral content. I mean, so sea salt is a great option. Yeah. Yeah. I think the pink has a little bit of a different makeup of minerals, but that's the difference, is when you have table salt, all you're getting is sodium and chloride. And sodium and chloride are two minerals that are electrolytes that exist outside your cell. So when you have a lot of sodium chloride, it draws water into the interstitial space, which is why you swell, which is why it affects your blood pressure when you have a lot of salt. But if you do the sea salt, then you're getting not just the sodium and chloride, but you're getting the potassium and the magnesium and a whole other profile of minerals. So it balances the minerals that are both inside your cell and outside your cell. So you shouldn't get as much of a fluctuation in fluid retention. And two, because there's more minerals, it's got more flavor, so you don't need to use as much. And so I let my kids salt their food, and within limitations, but they tend to, they will eat just about anything if they can put a little bit of the pink salt on it. And if we put either coconut oil or olive oil or a little bit of, I use a lot of grass-fed butter. Has everybody heard of Kerrygold butter? It's amazing. It will change your life. It is amazing. Like, the first thing you notice when you open the package is, it's like, oh my gosh, it's yellow. Like, regular butter is white compared to this stuff. And so it's just, the flavor of it is so much better, and it's the grass-fed. So he recommends Kerrygold butter. Yeah. He recommends Kerrygold butter, and then he recommends using something called MCT oil. MCT oils, it's medium chain triglycerides, which are basically, it's like coconut oil, but if you just got straight coconut oil is about 45% medium chain triglycerides, whereas if you get the MCT oil, it's like 90 to 95%. And MCTs are just a really good source of quick fuel for the body. And so a lot of people get good energy from them. It's also got a lot of great stuff for the gut. It's got caprylic acid, the butyric acid. A lot of that stuff is all great for your gut too. So when we look at our convenience fast food revolution today, most people are getting 35% of their diet from a whole foods source, which I actually think this number is a stretch, because I see a lot of diet diaries and a lot of people are not getting 35%. Omega-6 to 3 ratio, 20 to 1. Like I said, that I would say this is a pretty accurate number. A lot of the patients I see are around that 20 to 1. Some of them are, like I said, 40 to 1, 60 to 1. So I've seen pretty high too, as far as that ratio goes. Glycemic index, very high, because again, we're processing a lot of sugar, processing a lot of grains. We're hybridizing and genetically modifying our grains to be higher in starches, so they are even higher on the glycemic index. Stuff like corn and wheat are worse than they've ever been for us. ORAC score, our color score, is very low because we're just not getting a lot of whole foods in our diet, and so we're not getting a lot of colors. And I would say even people that are eating healthy, they're doing probably better than most. But even if you're buying food at Whole Foods or Green Acres, if you're buying stuff in a package, a lot of times it's still one step away from being a whole food. Where you find the whole foods is when you shop the perimeter of the grocery store. That's where your fruits and vegetables are, your proteins, your eggs, your nuts and seeds. That's where you'll find a lot of these whole foods. And it can just be one better choice that you make. Where if you're used to buying Cheez-Its for a snack, buy some nuts, and just have the nuts around, and just slowly start to transition yourself. And eventually, one good choice after another, and you'll radically transform your diet. It's not easy to do this. Believe me, this has been a 10+ year journey for me. All right, so this is where we're at today. 20 times more inflamed than we've ever been in the past. And then again, all these things that help protect us against that inflammation are decreasing. We're getting less and less of. And so this is why we're so sick. This is why inflammation is at the root of almost every major chronic disease today. And, not that, just fixing the diet can fix everything, but it's always the best place to start, because if you can reduce your inflammation, then sometimes, depending on where you're at in your disease process, sometimes you need something a little bit stronger than just changing your diet. But at least, changing your diet, you're going to reduce that inflammation. And I use a grass field analogy, and if you're eating a lot of foods that are inflammatory, it's like you're setting your field on fire every day, and you're not going to be able to heal your field or heal your soil if you're constantly on fire. And so, first step is douse the fire, reduce the inflammation, and then you can better assess what your body needs to really heal. So I've come up with 14, recommendations, to eat anti-inflammatory. And a lot of these we've talked about. And so pick one to start with and just kind of work your way through. But, my number one is eat a variety of fresh and whole foods. Just if you can get 80% of your diet from whole foods, then that is an excellent start to all of this. Eat more fish, so especially cold water varieties. Try to avoid the farm-raised fish, because they're fed corn-based diet also. And so you want to really focus on the freshwater varieties. Grass-fed lean meats, like I said, there's a lot of great farmers at the farmers market. You can meet great farmers. If you need an introduction, I can introduce you to the farmer I go to. She and her husband are fabulous. Lots of colorful vegetables, so when you sit down, to eat your dinner at night, we always joke in our family about the presentation, of the food. And if you've got, 4 or 5 colors on your plate, you're doing great, and so the more color you can have, not only the more appetizing is it going to be, but the more phytonutrients you're going to have. I touched on this, use spices and herbs to flavor your foods, because like I said, healthy food should not taste bad. And in fact, when you go to like gourmet restaurants, like the really good restaurants, the secret to their food tasting so good is they use fresh, real ingredients, and so, if you really want to elevate your food, use fresh spices and herbs, make your own salad dressing. You can use fresh herbs, especially in the summertime, grow a little herb garden and just pull some fresh chives or some fresh basil, chop it up, add some olive oil, squeeze of lemon, and a little balsamic, and you've got a great dressing. And so, so use, play around with that to really enhance the flavor of your food. And then kind of as a side note, also essential oils. If anybody uses essential oils, they are off the charts high in ORAC scores. So, so that's another great way, another great anti-inflammatory tool you can use. So when you cook, use the right types of fats, so I actually don't recommend olive oil a lot for high heat cooking, because olive oil, when you high heat olive oil, it turns from, if anybody's taking chemistry, it turns from the cis molecule form to the trans form. So you'll actually form a trans fat from olive oil if you high heat it. So olive oil is best just for low heat sauteing, or if you cook your vegetables, drizzle it on top afterwards. But stuff like coconut oil, anything that's solid at room temperature is going to be a more heat stable fat. So like butter, coconut oil, even avocado oil, even though it's not, solid at room temperature, is another high heat stable fat. Do you have a question? Very coconutty. Yeah, the unrefined would be better, and so just because it's less processed. And so the unrefined, though, you can't heat quite as high as the refined. And so if you want the benefits of coconut oil without the flavor, MCT oil is your best bet, because it doesn't have the coconut flavor, but it's actually taken most of all the good things out of the coconut oil. And it's more expensive, but that's a good one. And then butter, we use a lot of, the grass-fed butter to cook with. Number 7, identify your food sensitivities. So if you've got hidden sensitivities to, say, wheat or corn or soy, those can be hidden sources of inflammation. And so you'll want to really kind of be aware of those. Number 8, avoid your conventional vegetable cooking oils. We talked about that. Those are the ones that are real high in omega-6s. avoid or limit intake of all refined sugars. So sugar is one of those things that you just really don't want to have in your diet. And there's a lot of really great blogs and websites if you want to cook either low sugar, or you can pretty much substitute stuff like coconut sugar for regular sugar in any recipe. Or I found with most recipes I can have the amount of sugar that's in there and you don't even notice a difference at all. And so there are a lot of better ways that you can sweeten and sweeten foods without using refined sugars. And then limit refined grains. My bias is, I think most people should be gluten-free, especially with the type of wheat we have here in the United States. But even beyond that, I mean, some of the other grains like corn and rice and oat, they're really not a whole lot better. But wheat has gotten the most research. And, my theory with it is I don't think it's so much the wheat that's causing all the problems for people, but I think it's all of the pesticides and herbicides we're spraying on the wheat, all the fungicides after it's been harvested. All of that is creating these allergies. Plus, we're genetically altering, these foods, and so it's just making it harder and harder for us to digest. And I have yet to have a patient that doesn't feel better going off of wheat. It's just kind of universal. Everybody feels a whole lot better. So, and I've had a number of patients that absolutely cannot do wheat here in the U.S. that they go to Europe and they're fine with it. So that's why I do think a lot of it is in how we process our wheat. Number 11, limit your dairy products. Again, dairy is one of those things. I'm not as much a dairy Nazi, but with dairy, you do have to be aware that 80% of antibiotics used in our country are used on livestock. So passively, you're going to be getting a lot of antibiotics. A lot of steroids are used. A cow today will produce twice as much milk as a cow did back in the 1970s. So a lot of steroids. So, I mean, if you do dairy, definitely do it organic and use it as a garnish rather than a main course. Because again, you have to have that lactase enzyme, which we do produce, most of us do produce, but because we pasteurize all of our dairy, when you pasteurize dairy, dairy should naturally have the enzymes in it to help you break it down. But when you pasteurize it, you kill all those enzymes. And so it's harder for us to break down dairy. Yeah. We do almond milk at our house, but we don't do it a lot. I mean, I keep it around kind of for smoothies. We'll put it in smoothies. But I mean, we don't do a lot of cold cereal. Every once in a while, my kids will have it with dinner, but most of the time they just do water. So, I mean, a lot of parents, I encourage when kids hit, one, just transition them to water. They don't need this whole idea of calcium. I don't think I've ever seen a kid with a calcium deficiency, mineral deficiency, but I see kids all the time with zinc and magnesium deficiencies. And so I'm less concerned about the dairy, especially, if you're eating a standard American diet, you're getting plenty of calcium. So, yeah. There is, and there with grains, it's kind of one of those things that it plays into that blood sugar. So the more you have them, the more you want them. And so part of it is kind of just moving away from them in general. And so, but a few of the ones that we use a lot of almond flour and coconut flour to make breads. We use cassava flour and tapioca flour, which those are, I think, my kids find a little bit more satisfying because they have some carbs to them, whereas like almond flour and coconut flour don't have any carbs. And so you don't get that rush you get, when you have grains. And so a lot of it is just training your body and training your blood sugar. And I will say, like, I went gluten-free about 4 years ago, and it's no problem. I mean, it was really hard when I first did it, and now it doesn't even seem appealing. But I replaced a lot of that with gluten-free products. So I did a lot of rice, I did a lot of corn, I did a lot of oats, and those really took a toll on my digestion. And so within the past year, I've started to move away from a lot of those, and I feel a whole lot better. Now, I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but most of the time, if I can stay away from those, I just feel a lot better. So, so it is, I mean, one other thing too is to train yourself to, be satisfied with some of the carbs, like complex carbs from stuff like sweet potatoes, you know, from nuts and seeds have fiber in them. And so it's kind of retraining some of that. So when you're hungry, snack on nuts and seeds. They're great. They're a great, you know, source of fat, good source of fiber. They're low glycemic. Just make sure if you get the roasted ones, you know, a lot of times the roasted ones are roasted in safflower oil, sunflower oil, cottonseed oil. So if you get, you know, I recommend the dry roasted, or get the raw and roast them yourself in coconut oil. Just put some sea salt on them and they're really good. When you're thirsty, drink water. You know, drinks are a real big hidden source of sugar. I mean, a lot of people, my husband travels a lot, love him to death, but it's like, he was like, he was skipping breakfast every day. He's like, yeah, I don't have breakfast. He's like, but I drink a Powerade every morning. And I'm like, do you know how much sugar is in a Powerade? You know, so some of those drinks, you know, that we just don't kind of think about. Starbucks can have 50 grams of sugar in it. You know, can of soda can have 45 grams of sugar. So, you know, so really just shifting back toward drinking water, herbal teas is what your best bet for drinks. So black coffee is one of those things, as long as it's not something your immune system's reacting to, black coffee is actually a really great antioxidant. So I do recommend organic, you know, because you can get, you know, a lot of junk, you know, in regular coffee. But my one recommendation with is coffee and with black teas, with caffeine in general, is that, you know, they're called a diuretic, because when you drink a lot of caffeine, it shuts off certain receptors in your kidneys. So, you know, you could drink a cup of coffee, and then if you drink a big glass of water right after, your body's going to flush out more of that water than what it would hold on to. And so what I recommend is, you know, pick a time where you stop drinking caffeine, you know, 10, 11 o'clock, and then for the rest of the day, just drink water. And so as long as you do that, and first thing in the morning, first thing you do, drink a big cup of water before you start drinking your coffee. And as long as you're staying well hydrated, I don't have any problem with coffee. And so in moderation, of course. All right, and then number 14, eat organic as much as possible. And so kind of just as a little sidebar on organic, because I do get a lot of questions about this, you know, why should we eat organic? Is it worth it to eat organic? You know, and, you know, one thing I will say, you can actually Google this. If you Google, use of glyphosate, you know, you'll see a bar back in the 1990s. That was when certain seed companies, Monsanto, started developing seeds that were genetically modified. They made plants that were resistant to glyphosate, which is an herbicide. So what that means is that farmers could then spray glyphosate all over their plants, and it wouldn't kill the plants, but it would kill the weeds. And so and the way this was sold, and the way the FDA passed this, is that what they said was this chemical, glyphosate, works on a certain biochemical pathway that plants have that humans don't have. It's called the shikimate pathway, which is true. But what they didn't take into account is that even though we as humans don't have that pathway, the bacteria in our gut do have that pathway. So when you look at, during the 1990s, the increased use of glyphosate, you can mirror a curve of the increase in obesity, the increase in cancer, the increase in autism, the increase in a lot of these chronic diseases that we're seeing today. It mirrors that curve of the increased use of glyphosate. And I think, you know, my personal opinion is I think that is one of the biggest reasons we have the obesity epidemic today. I think a lot of it stems from our gut flora, because there's a lot of great research that connects, you know, your gut flora with, you know, your propensity for obesity. And two, when you look at how quickly Americans went from, you know, less than 8% of our population obese to over 35% of our population, for that to happen within about 20 to 30 years, I mean, just diet alone can't explain that away. I mean, to happen that quickly and that dramatically. And so my personal opinion is I think a lot of that stems from the disruption in our gut flora. And there have been mice studies where they've actually taken mice who are of normal weight, and they do a fecal transplant. They take their bacteria out and they put it in obese mice, and those obese mice become normal weight, eating the same diet. And they've done that vice versa. They've taken the obese mice, their feces, and put it in the regular mice and they become obese. And so there is, a lot of connection between our gut flora and our propensity for obesity. And so I think a lot of the issues we see that stem from our gut and our gut flora started around the time that we started increasing our use of some of these chemicals. Now, that being said, I don't know if anybody's ever seen this list before. This is called the Dirty Dozen. It's put out by a group called the Environmental Working Group. And they put out this list, and these are the 12 worst fruits and vegetables as far as pesticides go. So when they tested pesticide residue on certain plants, these had the highest amount of pesticides. So these are, if it's not in your budget to do all organic, these are some of the most important ones to get organic. And what's amazing is a lot of these you can find pretty comparable pricing, organic versus conventional. And so, but these especially, these strawberries and apples are two of the worst, and so you want to, any of your apples or apple products, you definitely want to do organic. Versus, the Clean 15, this is, some of the fruits and vegetables that came out pretty clean as far as pesticides go. And so it's not in the budget. These maybe you don't need to necessarily invest in to buy organic. And so, and then if you have the booklet, there's a recipe in there. I think it's 8 ounces of water, 1 tablespoon of vinegar, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. And if you spray that on your fruits and vegetables, that's an excellent fruit and vegetable wash, and it'll take off about 80% of the residue on the outside. So it won't get rid of all of the pesticides, especially the ones that get into the fruits and vegetables, but it'll at least take off most of what's on the outside. And so that's a great, and it's cheaper than buying the stuff at the store for sure. All right. So does anybody have any questions? I'm sorry, we're almost at 1:30. So if anybody needs to leave, you're welcome to leave. We can get through the rest of this here in about 20 minutes. And so we'll go a little bit over time. But I'm going to kind of zoom through some of this just so we can get through as many of these slides as possible. But basically everything we've covered up to this point sets the stage for, for what we're about to talk about, because inflammation in the gut is what creates leaky gut. So all the things we're eating poorly are what are going to create, the environment for this to happen. And so goes back to this idea that the gut we have is not designed for the world we live in. We overuse antibiotics. There are a lot of things we put in our digestive system that our body doesn't recognize, a lot of chemicals, a lot of preservatives. So, the response to that is inflammation and leaky gut. So if you've ever wondered, do I have leaky gut? These are some of the most common signs and symptoms of leaky gut. And of course, everybody knows if they've got digestive issues, constipation, diarrhea, bloating, gas, all of those can be related to leaky gut. But you don't have to have digestive issues to have leaky gut. Sometimes you don't have any digestive issues, but maybe you have headaches or migraines, or this is a big one, depression and anxiety. 80 to 90% of serotonin is made in the gut, so a lot of how we feel can be connected with our gut, gut feeling, that expression comes from somewhere. And so, like I said, inability to lose weight or gain weight can be related to leaky gut. This eczema, acne, skin issues, 99.99% of the time, it's something you're eating. It's a food sensitivity or it's inflammation in the gut. Brain fog, inability to focus, muscle, joint pain, fatigue, allergies, all of those can be related to inflammation or leaky gut. So when we look at the gut system, one of the most important pieces to recognize is something called the microbiome, which the microbiome is getting a lot more attention, here within the past 10 years. But basically what we now know is that bacterial cells outnumber our own cells 10 to 1. So we are more bacteria than we are our own cells. And in fact, I think it's like 4 to 5 pounds of us is bacteria. So we have not only in us, on us, but we have this bacterial cloud that's around us. So right now we're all, sitting in close proximity, and they're actually getting so good at identifying this that we could all leave the room and they could take an air sample within 30 minutes, and based on our own sequencing of bacteria, they can tell which of us were in this room or not. So it's almost kind of like a fingerprint. And so So this bacterial system is very important when it comes to us, so which is why all the hand sanitizers, all the antibiotics, everything we're doing to kill this bacteria, you're weakening that system. And so, we developed this relationship with this bacteria, before our ancestors had refrigeration, they were encounter close proximity with this bacteria all the time. And so, in fact, bacterial infections were the #1 cause of death for our ancestors, which is why we have this fear of bacteria. It's a healthy fear. But what we have to recognize is that, this relationship exists, and the more we chip away at that system, it affects our overall health. So certain things that destroy that bacterial system are, of course, antibiotics. If we get a prescription antibiotic, but like I said before, 80% of antibiotics are used in livestock. So passively, we get a lot of antibiotics in the food that we eat. Artificial sweeteners. If you have 1 packet of Splenda, that can wipe out half your bacteria in your gut. So artificial sweeteners do a huge number on your digestive system. And this is why all the research shows when you compare women who drink diet sodas with regular sodas, the women who drink diet sodas end up gaining 30% more visceral fat. So the bad fat, that packs in around your organs. You will gain more weight doing diet sodas than doing regular. So of course, neither is the best choice, but artificial sweeteners are not a good option. Certain chemicals in our water, so chlorine, chlorine is there to kill bacteria, but if they don't filter out all the chlorine and you drink it, that's going to have an effect on your gut flora. Same thing with fluoride. We don't have fluoride here in Wichita, but a lot of communities have fluoride in their water, and most of the fluoride that they want to help your teeth is bypassing your teeth, and it's just going right into your digestive system, creating, killing your gut flora. Stress, when you're under stress, your body is programmed to shunt blood away from your digestive system, and it turns off gastric secretions. And the way I tell people you can remember this is, if for ancestors, if you were about to be eaten by a bear, if you were about to become lunch, your body doesn't need to waste energy digesting your lunch. So picture that the next time, you're driving down the highway and you're in traffic and you're stressed and you're trying to eat your snack, you're not going to be digesting that very well, if you're under a lot of stress. So all these things are working against us to destroy our microbiome. So how we build it, one of the best ways is to get fermented foods and to incorporate fermented foods into your diet. So stuff like yogurt, the no sugar added yogurt, as a great source of fermented foods. Kefir is a fermented yogurt drink. You can get fermented sauerkraut pickles. Kombucha is a fermented tea drink. Miso and tempeh are fermented soy products. And then Bragg's apple cider vinegar is a great, it's a fermented vinegar. But getting a probiotic, if you've got digestive issues, the biggest problem I see with people in probiotics is they don't get enough. People are taking 5 to 10 billion, in their probiotic, and what they really need is closer to 100 or 200 billion. And so a lot of times it's a quantity issue, when you're taking a supplement with a probiotic. Now, just as important as getting this bacteria is what you feed the bacteria. And what feeds the bacteria in your system is fiber, so specifically inulin, but prebiotic fiber in fruits and vegetables will feed this good bacteria. So a lot of people take a probiotic or they do fermented foods, but if you're not getting this fiber, then you're not going to be feeding that bacteria very well. So this goes back to that, rule number 1, 80% whole foods. If you're getting most of your diet from a whole food source, you're going to be getting a lot of that fiber, which will feed the bacteria. All right, so when we think about what is leaky gut, this is a picture, a cross section of the small intestine, and this is exactly what's going on when you have leaky gut. So a normal lining in our small intestine looks like this, these 3 cells right here, because our small intestine is only 1 cell layer thick. Each of these is 1 cell right here, and these cells are held together by these protein junctions right here. And so typically what happens if you have a healthy digestive system is food is floating by right here. And when it gets to the small intestine, it gets absorbed across little hairs that exist on these what are called microvilli. So these little hairs, food gets absorbed across through this cell and it goes into the bloodstream. And so everything that gets into the bloodstream is filtered through these cells. So nothing gets by this barrier system that the body doesn't want in the bloodstream. But what happens when you start to get leaky gut is these proteins break down. So now all of a sudden you've got space in between these cells. So now all of a sudden all these foods and these proteins and those, remember I said if your stomach acid is low and you're not fully digesting your proteins, these undigested proteins, all of those larger food particles are now floating by in your stomach, and rather than going through this cell, they're finding their way in between these cells. So when you have a larger protein that makes its way in between the cells, like let's say this is a piece of corn that doesn't get fully digested, the proteins, all of a sudden now it makes its way through, and you've got most of our immune system, about 60 to 80% of our immune system is in the blood that circulates in our digestive system. So now all of a sudden everything that's finding its way through is getting attacked by the digestive system, creating, over and over and over again, getting attacked, creating a food sensitivity. So this is what leaky gut looks like. It's over and over again, things getting through into the bloodstream, creating stress on the immune system, creating more inflammation in this system. And so what you do when you heal leaky gut is you heal these proteins that create that tight junction in between those cells. And that way the body can then filter everything that gets into the bloodstream. Then eventually you can actually get autoimmunity, like something like celiac disease, where now all of a sudden you're actually destroying these cells that line the digestive tract. And that's a lot more severe. So what breaks down our gut lining? What is it that causes those proteins to break down? Probably the number one thing I see is this right here, 3 and 4, dysbiosis and candida overgrowth. So dysbiosis is the overgrowth of bad bacteria. So if you don't have enough good bacteria, or if you're taking a lot of antibiotics that's killing a lot of your good bacteria, that bad bacteria is like a low-grade infection, and that low-grade infection is going to create leaky gut. Or candida overgrowth, low-grade fungal overgrowth. That is going to create that leaky gut environment. And I see this all the time in kids. I would say probably out of, all the kids we've tested in 2017, I would say probably about 80% of them had some sort of fungal or bacterial overgrowth. Yeah. Yeah, so we do what's called, with kids, we do what's called an organic acids test, because it's a urine test, and that organic acids test will tell you if there's a fungal or a bacterial overgrowth. So, yep. For kids, we have what's called the Optimal Kids program, and so it's a program that we comprehensively look at all of that. But now other things, gluten, there's a protein in gluten called gliadin, and gliadin has been known to create leaky gut, whether you have celiac disease or not. Stress, can, like I said, it can decrease blood flow. It can increase permeability. So stress can create a leaky gut scenario, especially chronic stress. Certain environmental contaminants, all the chemicals and additives, preservatives, all the junk we've talked about so far can create leaky gut, including the drugs. Like I said, those NSAID drugs, aspirin, ibuprofen, all of those can create leaky gut. And, it's amazing. Antacids, especially, it's just been in the news, all those acid blocking drugs like Prilosec and Prevacid have been associated with higher rates of dementia, and so, so there's usually a consequence to doing things like this, long term. And so you're better using food as your medicine rather than trying to force a reaction. And I'll say this, for most of the patients that I see, it's usually a combination of these different factors, so it's probably somebody that's not eating a great diet, that is under a lot of stress, that all of a sudden gets a sinus infection and they have to go on an antibiotic, and they go on the antibiotic, and then all of a sudden they've got a lot of digestive issues, and then their digestive issues turn into joint pain, and their joint pain turns into brain fog. And so it tends to be this kind of snowball effect of, it's a combination usually of a lot of these different factors. All right, I'm going to skip through some of this since we're running short on time. One thing just to know is that your body has messengers. So if you have inflammation in your gut, there are messengers in your body called cytokines that will carry that message of inflammation. So somebody who's got especially autoimmunity in the gut is 50% more likely to have autoimmunity elsewhere. So we see a lot of Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, a lot of autoimmunity in the thyroid, a lot of brain fog, a lot of, headaches, issues with focusing, a lot of joint arthritis, muscle pain, adrenal issues, so that message of inflammation that starts right here can get carried all over the body. And typically the profile symptoms that people, they might be coming into us because of arthritis, but when you trace it back, they're like, oh yeah, I've been constipated for 20 years, and oh yeah, I do get headaches every week. And so it's like you start digging in a little bit deeper, and you can see how that systemic inflammation is affecting a lot of different areas. So how do we heal the gut? If you know you've got an issue, the best thing, this is kind of the program people go through, remove, replace, reinoculate, and repair. Remove, step number 1. This is the whole class up to this point. I strongly encourage people to play around with taking things out of your diet. You suspect something is an issue. If you think wheat's an issue, it is not going to hurt you at all. Especially if you're eating fruits and vegetables, you're not going to be missing anything if you take it out of your diet for 60 days. So take things out of your diet for at least 30 to 60 days and then reintroduce it. And most of the time, if you have an inkling that something's an issue, when you take it out of your diet and you build up that immune response, what you'll find is you'll have a much stronger reaction to it. And so, one example of this is we have what's called the 21-day detox program that we go through twice a year. We lead a group class of that. And time after time, in that class, we have people take wheat out and dairy out of their diet. And every single time we've done this class, there have been at least 2 or 3 people that when they go to put wheat back in their diet, they just can't handle it. It either flares their arthritis or it flares their digestive issues, but they figure out that they have a huge sensitivity to it. So anybody can do that. Start with some of the higher allergen foods like wheat and corn and soy and dairy, and try taking them out of your diet and see how you feel. And if you don't think it's an issue, put them back in and see how you feel then. And so that's this whole thing everybody can do on their own, and I strongly encourage that. If that doesn't take care of some of the issues you're having, then I would recommend seeking out the help of a practitioner to walk you through the rest of these steps. Because, once you if taking foods out doesn't quite heal your gut, you might have, like I mentioned, low stomach acid. If you've got a lot of symptoms of reflux, burping, you clear your throat a lot after you eat, or you get hoarse after you eat, those are all signs of low stomach acid. Or digestive enzyme issues. Like I said, undigested food material or fat in your stools, a lot of bloating, those can be either one of these issues. And, kind of my catch-all, if you think you have low stomach acid, the best thing to start with is add a little bit of apple cider vinegar prior to every meal. You can do a tablespoon of that in water or in juice, however you can get it down, but do a little bit of apple cider vinegar prior to every meal. And for a lot of people, like I mentioned that each time I do this class, and I've had probably 15 or 20 people come up to me and say, I did that after you told me to in the class, and I'm off my Prilosec. So it really can make a big difference with your stomach acid. But in digestive enzymes, there are actually a lot of digestive enzymes in plants, so again, getting a lot of variety of plants can really help with digesting your food better. Reinoculate. So this is getting that bacteria, so that's all those prebiotic fiber, that's in fruits and vegetables, and, probiotic foods, the good bacteria foods, or probiotic supplements. All of that will help with, protecting the lining of your digestive system. And then the last one, repair. These are some of the nutrients that are most commonly needed to repair the lining of the gut. And what we find with some of our patients that have more severe digestive issues, some of these nutrients they actually have to get intravenously first, because their gut is in such an inflamed state that they can't actually absorb these nutrients even when they take them as a supplement. And so so some of the most important ones are zinc. Zinc's a real important mineral. Zinc and magnesium are both real important minerals for healing the gut. B vitamins, especially the methylated forms of your B vitamins. Those are the activated forms of your B vitamins. It's the reduced form that most people can't process. And it's all the folic acid that's in, the foods that are fortified. That's the type of folic acid people can't utilize, but everybody can utilize the methylated forms. And then L-glutamine, this is an amino acid that is in proteins. It's in a lot. If you've heard of bone broth, bone broth being great for the gut. Part of the reason is it's got a lot of L-glutamine in it, and so L-glutamine is a real important one for healing the gut. And then these are all the nutrients that are real important for reducing inflammation. So stuff like turmeric, which is high in curcumin, and resveratrol is another really great anti-inflammatory. Both of those will reduce inflammation, and they'll also help balance out the immune system. So if you've got autoimmunity, both of those are really, really good for inflammation and autoimmunity. Vitamin D is, I don't try and pick favorites, but it's one of my favorites as far as supplements go. Most people are low in vitamin D. My daughter's 8 years old, and I give her and my other 2 kids vitamin D every day, and we just had her levels tested for the first time, and even taking it every day, she's still low in it. And so everybody has different needs for different nutrients, and that's one of the reasons why here at the Reardon Clinic, we encourage testing your nutrient levels, because Dr. Reardon, who started this clinic, was famous for saying, what's the most important nutrient you need to take? And it's kind of a trick question, because the answer is it's the one you're lowest in, and we're all different, and we all have different, biochemical needs. And so, but vitamin D is one. I think in my 5 years here, I think I've seen 2 people who are not taking vitamin D that have adequate levels of it. So most people need it, especially in the wintertime. Glutathione is another anti-inflammatory. It's also our body's main detoxifier. So if you get exposed to heavy metals, which we all do, it's glutathione that helps get rid of them. And so it's a real important one as far as the immune system goes. And then we talked about our omega-3 fish oils and how those can reduce inflammation. And so all of these are real important for balancing out the immune system and reducing inflammation, which a lot of that's in the gut. All right, so where do I start? Last slide. We made it. So again, I gave you the list of 14. These are my top 5, though. If you want 5 action steps, pick one of these today and start it. Try it. Get rid of sugar. So start with all the hidden sugar, or start with the obvious sugar, actually. Like if you buy Krispy Kreme donuts, don't buy Krispy Kreme donuts, and don't, buy Starbucks coffee, but then start kind of looking through some of the hidden sources of sugar, like yogurt. Yogurt can have 16 to 20 grams of sugar in it. Breads, like I said, are high glycemic. Your drinks and, cereals and breakfast bars, protein bars, Cliff bars, health food, Cliff bars can have 25 grams of sugar in them. So, so start kind of looking at labels. And like I said, the guide I give people is your liver can process about 25 grams of fructose per day. Most sugar, like most table sugar, is about 50% glucose, 50% fructose. So that means maximum your body can handle probably about 50 grams of total sugar, added sugar per day. Now, like I said, fruit has a lot of fructose in it. And so the 25 grams, beyond 25 grams, that's where you're going to start to store it as fat. And that's where you're going to put extra stress on your liver. So, so that's kind of a gauge for you. Significantly reduce additives and preservatives, so don't buy anything in a box. Definitely choose organic. I was just at Costco, and they had they were nacho cheese, tortilla chips. And again, they are not a health food, but they tasted exactly like Doritos. But rather than having the artificial flavorings, they were flavored with spices. And, rather than using the regular corn, it was non-GMO organic corn, so even if you're choosing one step better, choosing that over Doritos is a choice in the right direction. And I encourage you to kind of move in that direction. Of course, the best choice would be to skip them all together, though they were delicious. I did get them for New Year's. And then number 3, increase good fats. And like I said, if you are decreasing sugar out of your diet, since your body runs on sugar or fat, you've got to increase fats. Because if you just rely on protein for fuel, you're going to be miserable, because protein can be converted into energy. It's just a longer, harder process. And so, so fat is a really good source of fuel. Decrease your simple carbohydrates. So like, your pasta, your wheat, your crackers, your sugar. And then number 5, drink more water. Everybody can do that. What I typically do is I have magnesium in here, but I usually carry this around with me. And so I try and get 2 to 3 of these per day. And so these are 32 ounces. So a good gauge is take your weight, divide it in half, and that's how many ounces of water you should have per day. So somebody who's 120 pounds should have about 60 ounces of water per day. So, but if you carry it around with you, then it'll make you drink it a little bit more. So, all right, that's all I have. I have my email here. If you guys have any questions, you can definitely contact me. But if anybody has any questions now, I stick around. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so capsaicin is what makes peppers spicy. And so it is. I mean, it's an herbal. It's an anti-inflammatory herbal. It's got other analgesic properties to it. It helps with pain. So yeah, I mean, most of your herbals have anti-inflammatory properties to them. And so so it's probably not one of the ones I associate the most with anti-inflammatory, but it would be a good one for sure. So, yeah. Yes. Okay. So it's Jackson Family Farms. And so they only have a Facebook page. It's actually, she's a local internal medicine doctor here in Wichita. And they just started their farm about, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. So they haven't turned it into a full-fledged business. So it's all referral right now. And so you just kind of have to go out there, pick out of their freezer, but it's a great source. She's an internal medicine doctor. Yeah, she teaches over at KU, and they're wonderful. But even if you go to the farmers markets, there's a lot of great farmers you can meet there. But I just find their prices are really good, and their meat's really good quality. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Yeah. Yeah, so if you go to our YouTube page, we have it's not this exact class, but this class is pretty much, it's the same outline, and we kind of go through the same things. So it's a little bit of a different version, but it's up on our YouTube page that you can view anytime, and you can kind of skip around if there's certain sections you want to go back and rewatch, or you can come. We do it every Wednesday. Every first Wednesday of the month. It's the same class. So if you want to come back, you're more than welcome to come back and listen in. So. Yeah, so I mean, ideally you're getting your prebiotic from food. So you don't necessarily have to take it as a supplement. So if you're getting a lot of fruits and vegetables, you really don't have to take it as a supplement. But there are, again, just with the standard American diet, fiber is one of the things that they take out of a lot of processed foods. And so a lot of people do take it as a supplement. And like, you can think of the difference is probiotics is like taking the seeds, so you're actually taking the bacteria, whereas the prebiotic is like putting fertilizer down. So you're fertilizing those seeds. So you really need both, because, if you just throw seeds down and they don't have any fertilizer, they're not going to grow. Or if you just have the fertilizer with no seeds, then there's nothing to grow. And so you really need both we have something upstairs in our supplement store called Blue Heron, which is actually a really great prebiotic and probiotic. It's got both in it. And so that's a great supplement that I like to recommend. So, yeah.